Sometimes you get the downtown associations that say, yes, we love having a Park Once district. Or sometimes they were just a historic downtown that realized that public parking was an efficient way to provide parking and helped organize them. Today, what we find is that sometimes those groups will say, yes, we realize that minimum parking requirements are really a problem. We recognize they're doing a lot of harm. We realize they are inhibiting reuse of our own buildings. We realize it's not good to use them to block new buildings from coming in. And so they'll say, let's get rid of the minimum parking requirements. They'll also realize that subsidizing new parking isn't a good idea.
Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back to Reinventing Parking. I'm Paul Barter. This is the first in a series of short episodes that will focus on the idea of park once and walk districts and the walkable parking mindset that supports them. In other episodes in the series, we will ask various questions about this phenomenon, such as, would promoting park once and walk districts help us fulfill other important parking and urban mobility goals? How can we make existing park once and walk areas work better? What are the connections between park once thinking and the parking reform agenda of abolishing parking mandates? Can we extend the idea to areas that are not yet park once areas? And should we do that? But in this episode, we will look specifically at park once and walk in city centres, in downtowns. In many ways, these are the heartland of the park once and walk or walkable parking approach. Many, perhaps most downtowns around the world are places that are already park once and walk districts. It's a natural fit for such places. In addition to my voice, in this episode you will hear especially from Patrick Sigman, who is a California consultant and a pioneer of the park once and walk approach to parking. Patrick is also a member of the advisory board for the Parking Reform Network. You will also hear a little from two urban planning academics, Liz Taylor in Melbourne, Australia, and Rutul Joshi in Ahmedabad, India. Later episodes in this series will hear more from them and perhaps from some other people as well. But what is a park once and walk district? We're talking about the mindset that it should be normal to expect motorists to park somewhere in the vicinity of their destination rather than necessarily on site, and that the parking in an area should mostly be open to the public and for the whole area, not just one building or site. But unfortunately, most parking planning has the on-site parking mindset, under which most parking is expected to be for a particular building, and most motorists are expected to park on-site at their destination. You can also find out more about this idea of park once and walk districts or walkable parking on the Reinventing Parking website, reinventingparking.org. I asked Patrick to explain a little.
You can think of it as, in many ways, a traditional mixed-use neighborhood in a traditional city of the kind we built for thousands of years. However, parking is often operated as a shared resource. Sometimes it's publicly owned, sometimes it's privately owned, but it's very often used and shared by many people, and it's often used by several different vehicles throughout the day. It's often shared by several different users. So that concept of a park once district, in some ways, it often refers to just the kind of cities, neighborhoods that we used to build routinely all the time, that were compact and walkable and mixed use and happen to have some space for vehicles with wheels.
And Liz Taylor pointed out that in cities with a really old historic centre, that area usually has almost no parking, or is completely pedestrianised, or difficult to access by cars. So such places are necessarily park once and walk areas.
And I would point there to German cities as well as something quite distinct about them is that they were nearly all pedestrianised in the post-war period, particularly
the
70s.
City centres. Yeah, the city centres.
So almost making the city centres like a mall, not always enclosed, but, same kind of idea. they went to this kind of park house, I think they call them, municipal parking garage system. What I noted about them is they're really well signposted and communicated. So I remember Freiburg, for example, you go in to Freiburg, there's signage, electronic signage everywhere. Like they've got 3 park houses. If you want to go to the city centre, you're going to park at one of these and then you're going to walk the rest, and there's this many spaces left. Simple wayfinding thing that also kind of helps underscore the similar expectation to when you go to Westfield or something, is that you're going to park and then you're going to go and do a bunch of other stuff. So they seem to have done that quite well. It doesn't mean that they solved parking issues outside of that immediate central city, but they seem to have, without much incident, taken on that idea that you park in a park once place when you go to the city centre. So
Rutul Joshi made a similar point about the oldest parts of cities in India.
I mean, if you know the structure of Indian cities, there are a lot of historical sites where people actually avoid taking bigger vehicles. And they park in one place and they try to do shopping and then come back and pick up their vehicle from the other place.
Just before you go on, so the historical sites, you're referring to maybe the very old town neighborhoods where the streets are extremely narrow, or maybe even alleyways, places like Old Delhi or the walled city of Ahmedabad.
Yes, absolutely. So areas like that, which are never designed for cars to begin with. And so I don't think that it would be a completely alien concept for a lot of Indian cities. And actually, it will be much more functional and efficient if we plan some of our areas as Park Once districts.
So we see that one way that Park Once and Walk, or walkable parking, emerges in city centres is because old areas had almost no parking and no chance of getting much parking via requiring parking with new buildings via parking mandates. So the cities often had no choice but to emphasise public, city-owned parking rather than on-site private parking. But now let's consider a slightly different genesis. In busy mixed-use areas, as found in most city cores, just having some parking scarcity seems very often to cause a Park Once and Walk environment to emerge, even if the city does nothing to help. I put this point to Patrick Sigman. There's another pathway towards Park Once and Walkness in some cities that I've seen, where basically the owner of a building has some parking, say an office building, and in the conventional approach, the city would expect them to have their own parking for their own purposes, for their own tenants,
Right.
customers, employees,
Under a typical
etc.
minimum parking requirement, that's what's expected
right.
and required, yes.
Yeah. But, say, in various Asian cities that I've got some experience in, rapidly developing, rapidly growing, lots of old buildings without much parking, new buildings going up with parking, but the parking minimums are typically not quite as high as the US yet. But that parking was originally in the ordinance expected to be private parking, but the owners of these buildings quickly find that in a mixed-use, very dense, very intense, busy area, Asian city, that it's such an enormous bother to enforce against free riding, people parking there and going to other buildings. And they quickly realize, well, it's just much, much simpler to price that parking. Maybe they cordon off some for their own employees, or for their customers they'll have a validation system or something so that they can still have the parking for their employees, customers, tenants, etc. But instead of having a security guard saying no, they just price it. And so people who are visitors will park and pay, people who are tenants will park and not pay or validate, and it seems to work okay. And then you end up with this Park Once, but a lot of the Park Once parking, the public parking, is actually privately owned but open to the public. Does that happen in the US?
It does in the places where either we never had minimum parking requirements applied to begin with, or in the places where we removed them and owners are now able to do that because the market starts to emerge. And occasionally it happens in the places where we have ordinances that encourage it.
So in that first city centre pathway towards Park Once planning and walkable parking, most public parking tends to be city-owned. But notice that in this pathway towards walkable parking just now, it is private owners of parking who start to price their parking to prevent free riding. And so most of the public parking ends up being owned and run by the private sector. Which is better, public sector public parking or private sector public parking?
what I've found is that actually having the private sector own the parking is often a good thing. It's not always. The private sector isn't perfect. It makes mistakes. But one of the good things about the private sector is the private sector will usually say, yes, we would like to make some money from this parking that we built at very high cost. We would like the person who comes and uses this parking to help pay for it, right? So that then serves the public interest in terms of creating incentive for both efficient use of the parking and also reducing traffic and the associated pollution and traffic congestion. The problem with having the public sector own the parking is that then elected officials are making the decisions about what the prices should be and about what the rules should be. And unfortunately, oftentimes they come under political pressure to keep prices low and to give away parking for free to whoever is politically organized, right?
In India, where mass motorization is a recent and ongoing phenomenon, even some relatively new commercial districts are becoming park once and walk areas without city help. Rutul Joshi offered an interesting example from his home city of Ahmedabad. The CG Road area is a commercial area that emerged in the era when parking mandates already applied, at least in theory, but they were ignored in practice. Even though the resulting parking scarcity was mild, it has fostered a nascent park once and walk district, which would probably not have happened if every building really provided all of the on-site parking that had been expected under the parking mandates.
And then by early 90s, you have emergence of CG Road as a new area. So some buildings were supposed to build parking as part of their basements, but in those days the demand for commercial properties was so high that a lot of that basement parking was converted informally into shopping. And actually there have been a very interesting set of legislation and there have been court cases around this. It tells us a lot about the public policy and the parking policies in India. So a lot of those buildings were given penalty and they were regularized. And a lot of the buildings sort of continue to have, quote unquote, the parking deficit. And that's why some of the on-street parking was really helpful to manage that. And there have been 2 rounds of street design on CG Road. The first version of CG Road street design was where a little more parking was accommodated as angular parking. Vehicles would take a service lane to get into the parking while pedestrians are also sharing the same lane because it's only 24 to 30 meter wide road.
For the urbanist aficionados out there, this was a famous project actually by...
Yeah, so I think this was designed by Alan Jacobs and Dr. Bimal Patel, who is also an architect in the city, and he was instrumental in making that happen in early, I think that was 1994-95. And then I think the same set of people, Dr. Patel and his team, have redesigned this project in 2020 and 2021, where now they have taken away the angular parking, they've widened the footpath to 10 to 15 feet, and now there is only parallel parking. So at least the main road of CG Road, I would think that it's a park once district by itself. It's only a matter of expanding it to the larger area, the similar kind of concept.
Yeah, I remember the city government was trying to provide some city-owned public parking in that area. Has that proceeded?
Yeah, so they were forced by the courts to provide little more parking. But I think over a period of time, what has happened is now people have sort of started parking on the side alleys. At the same time, I think what the pricing of parking has done is a lot of people who are going there for shopping understand that there'll be limited parking here. So they either change their travel behavior or their driver behavior and they park away from CG Road and then they walk to that commercial district for shopping. And I think it's an interesting example of what pricing of parking and a limited amount of parking does to people's behavior.
Now let's take a look at the park once phenomenon in downtown areas in American cities. I asked Patrick Sigman about the damage done to such areas due to the rise of parking mandates.
I've had a middle class to upper middle class lifestyle just working on rescuing those districts. It's been surprising to me. It's such a problem that is stymieing so many districts in the United States that there's room for a lot of people to work on fixing this. The usual problem is that most American cities have a traditional downtown that was built before cars. Oftentimes they have numerous neighborhoods with Main Street retail districts that were also built before cars really took over and dominated everything. And more specifically, they were built before the invention of minimum parking requirements. So those districts are often mixed use because it wasn't illegal to mix uses yet. They often have the amount of parking that was useful before the invention of motor vehicles or back in, say, the 20s and 30s when, cars were around, but they weren't owned by every family yet. And those districts then often suffered a common fate, which was cities adopted minimum parking ordinances. And suddenly it became very difficult to do anything new in those districts. So, for example, you might have a furniture store and the city would pass a new ordinance saying, well, from now on, there are minimum parking requirements. So, for example, I grew up in Palo Alto, California. It's a university town next to Stanford University. The city adopted minimum parking requirements in 1951, if I remember correctly. So suddenly, all of these buildings in downtown Palo Alto that were built before this ordinance existed, in order to change land uses, this new ordinance said they had to meet this new parking ordinance. And the only way to do that was to tear down a building next door and put in some parking, or else to give up and not change the new use, or to somehow attempt to rebuild the building with parking, which was usually impossible. So the result often was that these districts just became sort of frozen in time. You couldn't take a furniture store and remodel it and turn it into a restaurant oftentimes, because oftentimes the ordinance said that a furniture store requires one parking space per 1,000 square feet of floor space, and a restaurant requires 20 spaces.
I also asked Patrick about the role of the Park Once and Walk idea and promoting that idea in rescuing downtown areas from the problems created by minimum parking requirements, parking mandates. You've got kind of a strategy for rescuing a downtown, but
Yeah.
Park Once and Walk is often part of that story.
It is. And oftentimes we'll show up to work with the downtown, and we often find that their current parking system and their current parking policies and ordinances are hindering all of their larger goals for their town. They'll say, well, we want more affordable housing, we want more vibrant economy, we want better public services for lower taxes, and we would like less environmental damage. And their current minimum parking requirements applied to their city are undermining all of those things. And we'll measure how many parking spaces there are, public and private, on street and off, and then we'll measure how full they are or how empty at different times of day. And oftentimes we find that the on-street parking spaces are underpriced and overcrowded. The off-street parking spaces are underused. The customer experience is often that when somebody shows up, the street parking in front of the most popular destinations is all full. And oftentimes people perceive a parking shortage. And if a visitor drives around looking for a spot, they'll find that there are these mostly empty parking lots that are signed with big signs that say customer parking only. And the message is, if you park here and visit the store next door, you'll be towed away.
Right.
So oftentimes when we add up all the numbers, we find that as a whole, perhaps 45% of the parking supply in that town will be completely underused. Like even at the busiest hour of the busiest day of the week, 45% of the parking spaces sit empty. So the diagnosis often is, all right, you have a perceived parking shortage. We've heard that from many people. But in fact, what you have is not a parking supply problem, but a parking management problem. We can often then move to solutions, and proposing a Park Once district or proposing improving the character of the place as a Park Once district is often part of the solution. So we could say, look, let's find ways, let's pick ways really to take a lot of your existing parking that is underused and get it to be well used. Or oftentimes, also, you should find a higher and better use for a lot of that underused parking.
Yeah.
A lot of times it shouldn't be there if you want to be economically successful. It should actually be a thriving hotel and restaurant that generates tax revenues and adds to the liveliness of this place.
And if you had proposed that without the park once and walk sort of mindset shift, you encourage them to shift their mindset from worrying about whether there's enough parking right there with a building versus, and you try to persuade them to think of the downtown as one place and to think about parking demand and accessibility more generally for that whole place, and the parking is part of that accessibility. Is that mindset part of alleviating their anxiety about things like taking away some parking or redeveloping some parking?
It often is, and it's often getting people to step back and look at the parking in the downtown as a whole and to see the big picture. So oftentimes when people are thinking about parking, they may simply be thinking about what they see when they look out the window of their shop. And when they look out the window of their shop, they see that the parking space in front of their shop is full and the parking across the street is full. And maybe if they're a city council member, they feel the same way. And they are not looking at the fact that they spent $10 million in city funds to build a garage, and they actually don't maintain data on when it's empty and when it's full. Or sometimes they don't think about the private garage that's underused because they never go into it because it has a sign that says it's for employees only.
And this brought us to the topic of on-street parking. In a park once and walk area, the city can stop micromanaging the supply and prices of all the privately owned, but public parking, they can manage their own parking. But cities do need to pay attention to the parking that they do own, especially the on-street parking.
The new thing that the city staff have to learn is they have to learn actually how to manage the street parking, which belongs to the city.
It is an important part of that pool of parking, the public parking. Mm-hmm. It's not numerically, it's not a huge number usually, at least in the American context.
Yes.
But it's a very prominent and important part of it to help the rest of the system be healthy, isn't it?
Yes. Oftentimes in a big city, downtown, the curb parking might be less than 10% of the overall supply. In some very small scale downtowns with a lot of street parking, like for example, Chico, California, I think it was about a third of the downtown parking supply. Very wide streets, lots of room for parking. So it's a small share, but it's the most obvious share. It's the most visible, the easiest to get to oftentimes. So it's important to manage it well. And that becomes the new skill that city planners need to learn. Cities need to develop that capacity.
To finish up this episode about city centre, park once and walk districts, I asked Patrick about the politics a little bit. In your experience, business associations, are they sometimes opposed, sometimes supportive of a park once and walk philosophy for a business district or a downtown?
They can be either way. It's quite unpredictable. Sometimes you get the downtown associations that say, yes, we love having a park once district. Many times the public parking systems in existing downtowns were organized by merchants and property owners who realized that they needed to compete with the new shopping mall on the edge of town. Or sometimes they were just a historic downtown that realized that public parking was an efficient way, oftentimes, to provide parking and help to organize them. Today, though, what we find is that sometimes those groups will say, yes, we realize that minimum parking requirements are really a problem. We recognize they're doing a lot of harm. We realize they are inhibiting reuse of our own buildings. We realize it's not good to use them to block new buildings from coming in. And so they'll say, let's get rid of the minimum parking requirements. They'll also realize that subsidizing new parking isn't a good idea. And so they'll support a park once system, and they'll support a park once system that's paid for by user fees. The bad side can be when you get that kind of district that's dominated by the property owners and merchants who are very short-sighted and are only thinking of new arrivals as a problem. If you're only thinking of the new arrivals as competition for the existing parking supply, then you're motivated to do whatever you can to impose requirements on them or charge fees that they have to pay, right?
I hope you found this episode about downtown park once and walk districts helpful and interesting. Look out for the other episodes in this Walkable Parking series, which should appear over the next month or two. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.